Hello, my name is George Fenton. I am one of the team that's been working on the ULS project, and I'm pleased to share with you today an outline of the asset management chapter that we are reviewing as part of the pilot process. This chapter covers standards for the management of assets, selection, performance, compliance, and environmental impact. And asset management in humanitarian aid refers to the combination of practices to control, reconcile, and manage physical assets, which are essential to the provision of assistance. The aim is to ensure that the required level of service is provided in the most cost-effective manner. And that this concerns the management of the whole life cycle of an asset, from acquisition, operation, maintenance, and repair to replacement and decommissioning or disposal. The increased use of the increased use of cash and voucher assistance, and particularly the increase in use of electronic systems for registering people affected by crisis, can potentially increase the type and quantity of physical assets, such as many more smartphones or tablets being used and more telecommunications equipment required. Standard one around management of assets states that asset management system is established according to the scope and purpose of the organization or intervention. And the key actions here are to ensure that an asset management policy and procedures are in place, and to determine a financial threshold to recognize and record an asset over a certain price, say $500 or $1,000, ensuring that alignment, of course, with organizations' financial and donor requirements are met. It's good to plan for the disposal or transfer of assets when an intervention is due to close. It's good to maintain an asset register for recording the most up-to-date and complete information on each asset. Of course, ensuring that any new assets are added to the register. Each asset should have attached also an identification label with a unique identification code, which is the principal identifier used in the asset register. Key indicators are to set a clear procedures and definitions for asset management, have an asset register that it contains things like model, type, serial number, etc. That the percentage of asset types that have a recognized lifespan established, and the percentage of assets that have been allocated without an asset identification label are noted and, of course, then followed up. General guidance around this is to adopt a proportional approach to the level of tracking of different asset types. Of course, basic tracking for a small number of low value assets is fine, but it must be more intensive for higher value assets. And therefore, it's good to focus on the value of assets and the critical impact on operations and any other relevant criteria that may be established. Of course, it's good to establish levels of accountability and the guidelines for the use of assets. And to increase accountability and simplify monitoring, it's best to assign an asset to a single user where possible, and ensure overall that there is a record of responsibility for each asset. As a minimum, an asset register should contain information on model, unique identity, custodian, serial number if appropriate, purchase value, purchase date, origin of funds, its location, and any inspection dates. Digital asset tracking systems can increase the quality of tracking by allowing more visibility and control through reliable data collection. But such systems, while they can reduce workload, they can be complex to set up. Asset categories are internally defined by each organization, but frequently used categories include things like telecommunications equipment, water and sanitation equipment, vehicles, accommodation, office equipment, generators, etc. Physical reviews of asset condition and location should be completed regularly, at least once a year, for all of the assets on the register. But again, the frequency of asset monitoring should be proportional. Standard number 2 states that assets are selected based on suitability to the local context and operational need. And key actions are around assessing the type of assets needed for your activities, taking into consideration the operational environment, and establish criteria for asset selection, identifying any risks related to operating or disposing of assets, determining the budget to manage assets through their life cycle, including not only purchasing costs, but also costs to operate, maintain, and dispose of them. And for short-term interventions, it's good to consider whether renting or sharing an asset is more cost-effective and sustainable than full ownership. Key indicators are around setting criteria for asset selection, and that this is appropriate to the operational context. Budgets should contain all costs related to acquiring, operating, maintaining, and disposing of assets, and the total cost of ownership of an asset should be in line with these budgets. Other considerations include ensuring that assets needs are included in project proposals and procurement plans on a timely basis, avoiding any potential discrimination being generated among staff through the different types of assets used. And it's of course good to focus on health and safety and security and environmental impact in using assets, and that these are linked to the acquisition and usage and disposal of assets. Basic criteria to select the most suitable assets could include things like not only the purchase cost and total cost of ownership, but also the market availability of the asset, or particularly the consumables and spare parts needed for it to maintain and repair it. And any other considerations around the regulatory framework or administrative constraints need to be considered. The economic and environmental impact of asset acquisition and disposal through its projected lifespan, of course, is a major factor. It's good to consider if an asset standardization approach is appropriate, as this will improve procurement and maintenance options. For example, ensuring all computers have the same specifications can simplify maintenance. Operating the same vehicle model simplifies spare parts acquisition and inventory management, and therefore can reduce costs. Note that if an asset is purchased with donor funds, the donor will usually maintain ownership of the asset throughout the project cycle. And also an asset usage, such as a vehicle, can put staff in a position of power compared to the local population. So this should be monitored to mitigate any potential abuse. And as with many standards, having a complaints mechanism in place is recommended. Standard number 3 states that good asset performance is achieved through optimizing operation and maintenance throughout its life cycle. And the key actions here are to ensure that the purchase, transport, installation, running, and disposal costs are budgeted, as was mentioned earlier, to cover the expected lifespan, ensuring that the users are trained to safely operate assets allocated to them and how they should be maintained or repaired. It's good to plan for asset availability, allowing for maintenance downtime. It's good to ensure that assets are properly secured and as is feasible given the operating contexts. Good to monitor running costs to identify when an asset becomes uneconomical to repair and therefore should be disposed of. Key indicators are around having thresholds set for lost, stolen, or broken assets. So if that becomes a lot, then action can be taken. It's good to monitor the percentage of staff that have been trained on using or managing assets, the percentage of assets that reach their lifespan target for useful condition, the percentage of time that an asset is available for use versus the time under maintenance or repair, and the percentage deviation from scheduled maintenance and repair budgets. Other considerations are to monitor regularly whether assets are being used as planned. For example, assets that are overused may not meet their targeted lifespan or would incur higher running costs. When acquiring an asset, clarify users' requirements, locations, estimated operating lifespan, as well as maintenance and replacement requirements. And when outsourcing an asset maintenance and repair program, ensure that quality standards and manufacturer guidelines are followed. Preventive maintenance is essential to ensure good equipment performance and reduce unexpected downtime and unexpected repairs. And any handover procedures and checklists should be used when an asset is transferred from user to user or possibly to a different organization. An asset is considered as damaged beyond economic repair when it cannot be repaired or the cost of this would exceed its residual value. Overall, it's good to document the method to safely and effectively dispose of an asset, and any donors owning the asset should be notified as per their regulations. Of course, there are different ways of transferring ownership of an asset, and when transferring an asset to, say, a partner, it's good to ensure that the recipient has the capacity and incentives to properly use, manage, and maintain, and ultimately finally dispose of the asset. Standard number 4 states that assets are managed conforming to legal and regulatory requirements, as well as adhering to the operation and stakeholder policies and, the organization and stakeholder policies and procedures. Key actions here are to understand and monitor the local regulatory requirements related to different types of assets and make sure that that assets comply with any technical specifications that are approved for use in the country of operation. It's good to register, of course, and maintain licenses and insurance for all relevant assets, such as vehicles and equipment, in accordance with local standards. And it's good to keep records of adherence to stakeholders, donors, partners, policies, and procedures throughout the lifespan of an asset, and as a minimum, comply with any technical specifications that are required by them. Key indicators include that an asset management policy is established according to national and international finance standards and best practices for the sector. You're good to monitor the percentage of assets that have a complete history recorded from acquisition to disposal or ownership transfer. And it's good to record the percentage of assets with an up-to-date license and registration documents, i.e. those that don't have them must be followed up. Other considerations are that you should consider that regulations are most important for those assets that can cause harm to people or the environment, such as generators or vehicles, and sensitive items such as telecommunications equipment should be managed in close compliance with local regulations. Donors often require evidence that an asset has been used for its intended purpose, and if an asset is transferred to a different country, export regulations must be followed, and you may require an export or re-export license. When disposing of assets, ensure that the transfer of ownership, any transfer of ownership, complies with legal regulations or tax liabilities. For example, if donating a vehicle, make sure that a transfer of ownership is legally recognized before the physical handover of the vehicle. Transfer ownership both when donating an asset and when accepting a donation must be managed transparently and be properly documented. Asset disposal processes can involve a risk of corruption, and therefore it's important that there is careful oversight of high volume or high value asset disposal processes. And the final final standard in this asset management chapter is around environmental impact. And the standard states that asset management limits any adverse impact on the environment, asset users, and communities served. And the key actions here are to consider the environmental criteria, such as sustainability when selecting an asset, looking for alternatives that use sustainable materials, less packaging, less transportation, require fewer consumables, or are more energy efficient, say using solar panels, can be safely disposed of locally, etc. are all considerations that need to be made. It's good to respect local environmental standards, but if these are unavailable or are unclear, use assets according to the most relevant internationally accepted standards. It's good to provide adequate training to staff about the environmental impact and hazards related to asset use and disposal, and ensure that the choice and type of asset is not generating or reinforcing any discrimination, as was mentioned earlier, particularly with regard to communities being supported. Key indicators here are that the percentage of assets disposed meet organizational safety and environmental standards, that the percentage of assets that can be locally maintained, repaired, and safely disposed of is recorded, and the number of briefing sessions on environmental best practices, sensitizations, and training to staff involved is also monitored. Other considerations are around assessing the type of waste that may be generated through using different types of assets, such as chemical or gas emissions, other pollution. And for disposal of such waste, you must make the appropriate plans. Assess the local capacity to safely process any hazardous materials, and avoid assets that cannot be safely, or assets that generate waste that cannot be safely processed via local waste management. If it's critical to use an asset which has components that cannot be safely reprocessed locally, consider reverse logistics options to safeguard the local environment, and it may be that you have to re-export waste materials, but as a last resort. Where practical and feasible, define the impact indicators to track the environmental performance of assets, and track the usage and monitor the power consumption of all relevant assets in order to identify and correct any environmentally damaging practices, such as continuously using air conditioners when they're not needed, or running vehicles and generators when they're not needed, and ensure that any maintenance and repair activities control hazardous materials and waste, such as the disposal of waste engine oil. And when selecting assets, reconditioned items might represent a greener choice than a new product. However, there are also risks associated, and organizations should make informed decisions about the different types of assets and how to manage waste and environmental impact. I hope that you found that short briefing about asset management useful, and please look out for other videos explaining our other ULS chapters.